Next, we are going to talk about Egypt, the first unified nation, one of the earliest advanced civilizations, and one that developed differently than Mesopotamia. Whereas Mesopotamia had this kind of culture fearing death and fearing and battling nature, where a lot of the different creation myths and stories focused on floods and death and destruction because of the geography of Mesopotamia, as we spoke about last week, that the rivers flooded, that they were dangerous, they were unpredictable, and they needed to be fought against and tamed. Egypt was quite different. They developed a very stable and unified society, not like the city-states of Mesopotamia that were usually struggling against each other and competing for resources. Egypt's geography was more stable. They developed a very unified and deeply religious society with a more positive understanding of death because they really benefited from certain geographical features that helped their society flourish. And that being the Nile. People who lived in Egypt migrated from the Sahara Desert and settled along the Nile River, and the Nile would really become their lifeline. This was their source of life. The Nile had predictable flooding, unlike the flooding in Mesopotamia, so this created a fertile farmland close to the river and supported a strong population growth in cities along the river. So Egyptian society was probably the most river-based. They did not settle and stray very far from the river, as you can tell from this map here that shows the three different kingdoms spanning several thousand years, and they all really just hug that Nile River, and they do not stray far from that. As you can see, they are divided between two deserts, the Eastern Desert and the Western Desert. You have the Mediterranean Sea to the north, you have the Red Sea to the east, and you have mountains and waterfalls to the south. So it's a very insulated society, perhaps more isolated than Mesopotamia, which was in the crossroads of Asia and Europe, and there's a lot of trade going on here. In Egypt, they are more insulated by their environment, by these deserts and mountains and seas. And that's why they really kind of unify and create this common culture. And it also protected them against invaders. The sea to the north, the Mediterranean Sea, would have connected them to places such as Italy, Anatolia. They would have been able to trade with people groups along the Mediterranean Sea. By 3000 BCE, the Egyptian king Narmer unified the upper and lower territories of Egypt. As you can tell here from this map, Lower Egypt was to the north. It was lower in geography. Upper Egypt was to the south, closer to the mountains, further from the sea. So these are two different areas, and one king would eventually unite them to create the first Egyptian kingdom. And he called himself the King of the Two Lands. These early Egyptian kings would create a large centralized state called the Old Kingdom. You can see the dates here on this map. The Old Kingdom would have been the first Egyptian kingdom, unified kingdom. They created this really central authority where they would have divine power from the gods. They would claim that the gods favored them and blessed their rule, and that they were the gods' spokesperson on earth. And they claimed to have something called Mat. So it's this truth or divine justice that kept the forces of nature in balance. So it's this struggle against nature, it's this struggle against the rivers, the flooding, disorder, chaos, and Mot was keeping that stuff in balance, keeping things in balance so that people can thrive and prosper, that the gods were pleased with them. And it was really the pharaoh's job to balance these forces, to balance disorder, keep it at bay, to keep the rivers flowing as they should, to keep the floods predictable. So all of these different things needed to line up perfectly for their society to prosper. And in Egyptian thought, as long as this balance was maintained, the rivers were flooding properly, the crops were doing well, then that meant the king was doing a good job, that he possessed Mot. If they were not going well, if disorder was ruling, if there was a famine, if the floods were not behaving predictably, then the king was seen to not have this divine justice. He did not have this mot, and he was not favored by the gods. And usually when these periods would happen, when there was floods or famine, that would really delegitimize the Egyptian king in the eyes of the people. And then we would go through these periods called the intermittent periods that we're going to talk about later, where the kings lose power, there's instability in the land, and there's war between different powers within Egypt. So if the king was not bringing favor to his people, if he was not bringing prosperity, it really weakened his authority. Kings would also demonstrate their mot. They would demonstrate their success and their favor with the gods with large building projects. So large building projects such as the Great Sphinx and the pyramids would show the people the gods are favoring them with prosperity. That only such a mighty prosperous king, which had the true divine justice, was able to carry out such large building projects. And it really does show how effective and centralized rule was in Egypt, that the kings, the central powers, were able to orchestrate the building of these pyramids, which were obviously quite complex, and people are still trying to piece together how they were able to build them, and it was not aliens. So it really shows that the power that they had to orchestrate and mobilize their people for these great building projects. The Egyptians were polytheistic, meaning they believed in multiple gods rather than just one god. And all of these gods, just like the Mesopotamians believe, controlled different aspects of the world. So some would control the floods, some would control crops or fertility. Again, very similar to the Mesopotamians and most religions of this time. The Egyptian gods, though, had both human and animal features. So you would see humans with the head of a bird, or vice versa, different features of animals and humans combined. One of their main gods was Ra, the god of the sun. And they had complex rituals and offerings to please the god and maintain their good wills and to make sure that they were in favor with the gods. The pharaoh, though, the king, was himself considered divine. So he was a godlike figure who, again, his purpose was to help his people win the favor of the gods by ruling with Mot. So that means the pharaoh had to show piety in his daily life. He had to show that he was holy, that he was worthy of the god's favor. So he had a strict schedule. It determined everything about his life. When he could bathe, when he should go for a walk, when he should make love to his wife. He had a very strict schedule to follow in order to show that he was being a good mediator between people and the gods, and that he was in possession of Mot. Death was a pretty important part of Egyptian society, and it was again viewed more favorably. The Egyptians viewed it more favorably than the Mesopotamians did. They were not as fearful of death. They believed death was just a temporary interruption. It was not something to be feared. It was something to welcome. It was the next stage in life. It was the next stage in their being. And they believed that after dying, they would reach a place of peace and plenty. They had a manuscript called Book of the Dead, which provided a lot of different instructions and spells to help Egyptians find life after death and to help find that peace and prosperity and place. Their body had to cross over, and the Book of the Dead was like a guide in how to get there. They believed if they lived a just life, that would help them earn a more favorable afterlife after they died. And they had a lot of rituals and offerings that would also help them find this peace, find this prosperity in the afterlife. They took a lot of steps to preserve their bodies after they died because they believed that those were the bodies that would carry them into the afterlife. So they would embalm their bodies, they would mummify their bodies, and they would bury them with their belongings because the belief was that they would be taking these belongings with them into the afterlife. So, I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with the mummies, and probably a lot of people have seen this popularized in some type of movie. But that was really behind it. That by preserving their body, by burying them with their possessions, that was going to help them pass over to a more peaceful, prosperous afterlife. Because they had such rituals surrounding death, because they were mummifying, embalming bodies, they were dealing with a lot of dead bodies, which actually taught them a lot about the human body compared to other people of this time, who might burn or bury their dead and be done with it. The Egyptians were going through all these rituals and offerings that put them in close contact with human bodies. So they learned a lot more about them, and they actually developed a lot more medical treatments and medicines to help different illnesses because of that knowledge of the human body, the ins, the outs, the organs. The Egyptians knew the human body like other people did not. So they were able to treat different illnesses. They were skillful at sewing up cuts, fixing broken bones. All of these things they really learned from their rituals surrounding death. They would end up writing the world's first medical book using papyrus scrolls. Again, this is what we believe to be the world's first medical books, because nothing earlier has been found by historians or archaeologists. Because of this importance of death, rulers would spend vast amounts of resources on tombs to protect the body and proclaim their divine status. So if we can take whatever we want into the next life, the rulers have to show, this is who I was in life. They built these vast pyramids. They were their tombs. They would bury their stuff with them, and it was really a proclamation of the king, the pharaoh's power, as well as a vessel to carry his belongings into the following life. The Egyptians were highly advanced compared to other societies, again, in their medical knowledge and their bureaucracy and the power and organization. Again, just looking at these vast building projects, the fact that they were able to build such vast wonders of the world. They were prosperous in agriculture. They were considered, even many years later during the Roman Empire, the breadbasket of the empire. So they had fertile land. They had a strong, organized central government. They had the written word, hieroglyphics. They had advanced religion. So they realized this, that compared to other civilizations, they considered themselves to be more superior than other kingdoms and people. So they did have this sense of superiority, that they were an advanced civilization, and they would look down on other people groups. And again, their geography really helped them with this, with the fact that they were able to remain united and develop this society. The rivers were predictable. They were insulated from outside invaders by a desert on both sides, and they really had the freedom and flexibility and resources to grow this society. When we talked about the Mesopotamians and how when they went from the Paleolithic to Neolithic era, and when they started settling in cities, their gender differences started to grow more unequal between men and women. This would not quite happen to the Egyptians. The women would enjoy more legal rights, and their gender equality was closer to the Stone Age, when people were hunters and gatherers, and there was more equality between men and women. Egyptians would preserve that more than other societies like the Mesopotamians that we spoke about. Women had more legal rights and similar legal rights as men did. They could own land, they could own slaves, inherit property, they can pursue lawsuits in court, they could initiate their own divorces, and these are things that women could not do in other societies of this time. As you can tell in this image on the screen, the man and the woman is depicted the same stature, so they have equal status. If Egyptians considered them to be unequal, they would make the women very small. So you could see a wealthier Egyptian couple standing side by side, standing equal to one another in stature, representing that they are again equal, they have equal status. And there's other people that are smaller, oftentimes that would depict their lower status in society. So women were able to also take on tasks. If there was still some differences where men would still dominate public life, while women would control the home life, the domestic sphere. They were in charge of the home, men would go out in public. And this is, again, because of the hunter-gatherer differences, where men would leave to go hunt and women would stay at home raising the family. So women would manage the household and property, but women could take on their husband's task if the man was absent. So if he left for a prolonged period, the woman could step into the man's role and do his tasks. And another part of their society was wisdom literature. So Egyptians were deeply concerned with manners, with proper decorum. They placed a high value on standing rigid and having a proper posture, standing rigid and poised. You could see that in their art. Again, in this picture, they're standing very straight. They placed a high value on that. They placed a high value on manners in general. So wisdom literature would basically give instruction on the proper behavior and how to have proper behavior between people of different statuses, and how to have proper behavior with the gods. And again, this is all very important in considering Mot, right? Like this divine order, this balance, and that would give them prosperity with nature, with their rivers, with the floodings. Wisdom literature would help them lead these lives. So this old kingdom would end when the Nile's predictable flooding did not materialize. That would weaken the king or the pharaoh's power. So the flooding did not happen, and the Egyptians believed that their king must have betrayed Mot. So leading families who had wealth, so different nobles in Egypt, revolted against the pharaoh and started trying to claim power for themselves. So there was a civil war between the upper and lower kingdoms in Egypt, ending the unity. This would lead to the first intermediate period where there's no clear unified government. There's no clear unified central power. It's a period of instability. So that's the first intermediate period. So it's kind of intermediate. It's in between two periods of stability. So this would be followed until the kings would eventually reunite Egypt again into what is considered the Middle Kingdom, where the kings would restore central authority, restore the monarchy, push the boundaries of Egypt further south, and expand trade with other lands. And we can look at the map again. In the Middle Kingdom, once the kings got power once again, they spread their power deeper away from the river. And then the final kingdom, the New Kingdom, they would spread further northwards and further southwards. So within that Middle Kingdom, it would last for about 3 centuries until the second intermediate period, when a people from the north, the Hyksos, as you saw from that map, invaded Egypt from the north. That would end that Middle Kingdom and bring about the second intermediate period that lasted 200 years until kings from Thebes reunited Egypt into the New Kingdom. The kings of the New Kingdom would restrict the power of regional governors and promote a new sense of national identity. So they reunified the country and weakened regional rulers. So bring power back to the kings. They earned the title of warrior pharaohs because they used foreign wars and diplomacy to promote Egypt's interests, gain territories, and demonstrate superiority. And we saw that in that map as that new kingdom would conquer even more lands for Egypt. So these were called the warrior pharaohs. These pharaohs from Thebes, you can see their origin right here on the map, right along the Nile, promoted the cult of a god, Amun-Ra. So they really focused on this god. Even though they had this pantheon, they believed in multiple gods, they really held Amun-Ra up to overshadow the other gods. And the pharaoh Akhenaton made the worship of Aten, a manifestation of the sun god Amun-Ra, the official religion. So stressing the power of the sun, obviously for reasons it gives light, it gives source, it gives energy, it's necessary for crops. And some considered this to be a step towards monotheism, that he's stressing this one God above all the other gods. We're going to read a primary source that talks about that for your discussion this week. So this ode to this God, to Aten. In everyday life, though, most people do not really buy into this monotheism, this worshiping of one God, the sun god. They worship all of the gods in their daily life and pray to all of them for protection. So Egypt was very conservative in that sense, that it was not easy to change. It was not easy to change their society. As you can tell, it lasted for thousands of years, much older than the United States of America. And some people might think our history is old. If you look at ancient Egypt's history and stability and unity, life went on in pretty much the same way for hundreds and hundreds of years. They were very concerned with the afterlife, put a great deal of effort into preparing it. We're going to read a source this week about their god Aten